Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, May 3rd. This week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken returned to the Middle East for the seventh trip he's taken since the Hamas attacks on Israel back in October. Topping the list of issues he wanted to address, of course, is trying to get a ceasefire in Gaza and getting more humanitarian aid into the Strip. But he also worked to finalize a deal with the Saudi Arabia that would be the basis of normalizing relationships between Israel and the Saudis. What is that deal, and will it in fact come to fruition? Then we'll take a look at Europe, where French President Emmanuel Macron delivered a particularly dark lecture about the continent's future, warning that, quote, Europe can die. What's behind the growing pessimism, and how is Europe going to respond? And then finally, a somewhat forgotten conflict, the civil war in Burma. 3 years after the military junta overturned the country's fledgling democratic government, the military is on its back feet as various rebel groups unite to take back control of the country. Can the rebels win? And what would victory mean for the people of Myanmar? Here to talk about all of these issues are the three reporters who cover these stories. Deborah Amos is Ferris Professor of Journalism in Residence at Princeton University and formerly international correspondent at NPR. Steve Erlanger is Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. And Giles Whittell, Deputy Editor at Tortoise Media. Good morning, actually, since you're all in Europe. Good afternoon, everyone. Wonderful to have all of you back. On World Review, just to have our conversations. Deb, let's start with you. The Middle East, a lot of things happening. Blinken was hoping, of course, for a ceasefire deal while he was in the region. He was pressing the Israelis to bring aid in, and of course, he was working on that deal with the Saudis that has been sort of in the water. Or at least in the taste of it for quite a long time. So bring us up to date about where we are.
So before I talk about it head on, I want to note a piece today in the New York Times that talked about behind the scenes in Israel. Officials have been weighing this plan for post-war Gaza, in which Israel would offer to share oversight on the Strip with an alliance of Arab countries, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, as well as the U.S. Now, lightly sourced, put somewhere in the middle of the paper, not at the top. So, you have to read those tea leaves and say, how serious is this? We don't know how much it means for the Saudi deal, but it certainly is either a pressure point or people wanted this story out. So let's talk for a minute about the Saudi deal. I think Tom Friedman essentially did the shorthand for it, New York Times columnist, when he called it Rafah for Riyadh. The idea is the Israelis do not have to go into Rafah, and this deal commences. Now, the deal brings us back to before October 7th. And this was on the table. It was the Americans who talked about it. It would be a historic agreement between the Israelis and Saudi Arabia. The Saudis would get a different category of weapons. They would get a domestic nuclear agreement. And there would be this new normalization of ties between Israel and the Saudis. All of this went out the window in the attack of Hamas on October 7th. But the deal is back. This is why I think Blinken is spending so much time in Riyadh. But there's a couple of new parts to this agreement. One is there has to be a ceasefire, and the Saudis insist there has to be some path towards Palestinian statehood. But ceasefire is the most important. And that's what we're all waiting for now. So far, the Israelis, as the Americans say, have given a more generous offer than ever before. The external Hamas leadership says that they are looking at it with a positive attitude. There are reports and Arab commentators I've talked to said that the outside leadership is frustrated with the inside, and they would like to have this ceasefire agreement. It is not clear whether it is close. There is one man at this moment who could derail the whole deal, and that is the head of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, reportedly hiding in a tunnel surrounded by Israeli hostages. What's in it for him? Even people in Gaza are beginning to speak publicly about their frustration. So it is possible that we don't have a ceasefire and Benjamin Netanyahu carries out his pledge to attack Gaza, whether there's a ceasefire or not. And so I think all of us are waiting to see. It's as close as it's been, but that really doesn't mean anything. Only in horseshoes, is close a win. This is not where we are. Either they say yes, and there's a ceasefire, or there could be an all-out offensive on Gaza that the Israelis have been promising.
Deb, that's a great summary. I think that puts it exactly where it needs to be. And then the question, I think, Steve, is there's the question of Sinwar, the Hamas leader in Gaza, accepting the deal. There's also the question of whether the Israeli government will ultimately accept the deal, or whether they are in some ways just putting it out there in order to blame Hamas for not having a ceasefire so they can continue to fight the war, because Bibi Netanyahu is being squished by all parts in his own coalition. So talk us a little bit about what's happening inside Israel and how Netanyahu is trying to navigate the various pressures that really are starting to grow, both on the left within his coalition and on the right, if there's such a thing as within the center of the coalition and the right, put it that way.
Well, we've been trying to get this ceasefire since, if you remember, before Ramadan. This was supposed to be the Ramadan ceasefire. The Americans are more and more explicitly blaming Hamas for not agreeing to the ceasefire. The basic problem remains, as it has been, which is Hamas insists on a permanent end to the war and an Israeli withdrawal, and the Israelis say, no, that's not going to happen. We will give you more prisoners, and we'll give you high-level prisoners, and we're willing to accept fewer hostages than before, but we're not going to let you rise out of the tunnels in Rafah and say, we won. That's not going to happen. And frankly, I think Israel, the military logic is Israel will do Rafah eventually. It doesn't have to do it now. It can do it in 2 months or 3 months. It can do it slowly. It can do it differently. The big fighting in Gaza has been over now for more than a month. The Israelis only have one brigade in Gaza, which is between north and south. There's stuff in the tunnels, but we're waiting. And the Blinken people, Jake Sullivan, they're kind of dreaming of a ceasefire that could be turned into something permanent. And it is true, as Deb says, the Israelis are talking of finally some sort of day after, but the day after they envision, at least as we've reported it, is unacceptable to the Saudis, because the Israelis say they're going to keep their military going in and out of Gaza. And the notion of an agreed path toward a Palestinian state is sort of absent, and it's all much slower. So there's a military reality and a logic which, frankly, most Israelis support. They want Hamas dismantled. They don't want Hamas to win this war. And there's the political pressures on Netanyahu and on the government from inside and outside, much as you've both described it, which are quite severe. And he's being accused, as usual, of being indecisive, because he is indecisive. And he is under quite a lot of pressure. But I think the pressure from the far right is a bit exaggerated, because they have nowhere else to go. I mean, if there were a new election, they would get clobbered. They wouldn't be part of any new government. And it's a difficult moment, but now we're kind of all waiting on Hamas, and only two people will make this decision. One is Sinwar, and the other is his defense chief, Mohammed Deif. And the people outside living in their beautiful Qatari hotels don't have much of a say, to be honest, in all of this.
It's in some ways, Steve, paints a pretty dark picture, because it doesn't seem that the incentives on either of the sides is to end this war. The incentive, Giles, is really to continue the war, and yet the pressure from the United States, the pressure from the Arab countries, the pressure from Europe is all leading in the opposite direction, and it does raise the question of who's in control here, or who has leverage, and how do you move this way forward, given that you have really about 4 or 5 people who are standing in the way. In the Israeli case, a large majority of the Israeli public supporting that as well. Not a temporary ceasefire, yes, but not an end to the war.
The optimism from outside is loud. We hear a lot about prospects of a deal. And by the way, the fact that the grand bargain between the US and Saudi, with possible Israeli involvement at this stage, the fact that it's still on the table at all is remarkable, that it survived 7 or 8 months of the fighting that we've seen. But yes, there seems to be a fundamental tension between optimism such as it is on the outside and the reality underneath Rafah. If what we hear from the Israeli military about the Hamas military rump in southern Gaza is true, namely that there are perhaps 6 fighting units left there, plus the military command. And if what we hear from the Israeli government, from Netanyahu from the beginning, that their goal is to defeat the eradication of Hamas as a military force, it remains the goal, then it's very hard to see how you get to a ceasefire, let alone a lasting one. My own view is that it's the case now, as it always has been, that military defeat of Hamas is whack-a-mole. It can't really happen. But I don't see in any of the proposals for a ceasefire a resolution to that fundamental problem, which is that unless you go in and antagonize your enemies even more, as Israel, and get into the tunnels under Rafah, you haven't solved the problem that you set out to solve in the first place.
Deb, I want to come back to you, because I think Giles is right. It is surprising that the big grand bargain is still on the table, and in fact, actively being pursued by Washington and Riyadh, although not Jerusalem. And Deb, you know Saudi Arabia well. Why are the Saudis still pushing this? What do they hope to achieve other than some of the benefits of the deal, and they think they can actually get there?
Because they really want it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing this. And that's very clear. And, Arab analysts I talked to today said it's very close. There's been this plan B that's been floated, that it's, a thinner version, and it's just between the United States and the Saudis. I think that would be tougher to get through the US Congress. But they get a lot for this. They get a domestic nuclear program blessed by the United States. They have to essentially boot out the Chinese, but they get help in establishing much more, they become a technology hub in the Middle East. It's worth their while to do this, but, they have conditions and they're not willing. I think the era of the Saudi or the Israeli policy of mowing the grass, and which is what they used to call what they did in Gaza. Every couple of years, this would happen, and rich Arab countries would come in and clean up the mess. I think everybody's done with that. We're not coming back to fix this. We're not coming back to pay for it, and we're not cleaning up this mess this time. And so you can see that there's all kinds of pressure. I mean, who wins? We don't know yet, but there's all kinds of pressure to get this done and over with. It may not work. It may not work, and the Israelis may still go into Rafah. But I don't know. I've been hearing and reading lots of ex-military people from Israel that says, an attack on Rafah could be a trap, that Sinwar survives. And then what do you do? And does he keep the hostages alive, which apparently he is surrounded by? That's the reporting. I can't confirm it myself, but that is the reporting. And so any decision is fraught. Everybody is weighing their own logic on where to go. But I think for the Saudis, they wouldn't still be in it if they didn't really want this deal.
And I guess the same is true for Steve for the United States. They really want this deal too, because the ceasefire plus this is how they get out of the morass politically and strategically in some ways that they found themselves in since October 7th.
Yes. No, I mean, this is really true. And they've done a lot of work to hold the Arabs together. But one should also remember none of the Sunni Arabs want Hamas to win, and they don't want Iran to win. So they give lots of room to the Israelis. In their heart of hearts, they like Hamas to be dismantled. But we'll see what happens. More important, almost for the Israelis, frankly, is the Egyptian border, is securing the Philadelphia route. The Egyptians are having issues with that, of course. The old agreement is well out of date. And I'm told the Americans and the Egyptians and the Israelis are discussing a new, better technological barrier to be built inside Egypt that would be monitored by US and Israel, as well as Egypt, of course, to stop the smuggling that Egypt insists publicly doesn't exist, but it does. So that's the other issue. You can go around Rafah if you want. And of course, even the Israelis understand that if they're going to do Rafah, they need to get 1 million people out of the way, or close to 1 million. That's not going to happen quickly, even if they decide to do it. So as Deb says, there's a lot of political pressure. There's a lot of rhetoric going on. But the reality is, as ever in the Middle East, harder to discern, put it that way.
And, there's one more issue about this plan to move 1 million people. If you put them on the coast, who's going to feed them? UNRWA? Is Israel going to cooperate with UNRWA? I doubt it. And so that's another big bureaucratic hassle. Do you let them all go back to the north, which is also being talked about? But where do they live? The north of Gaza is fairly flattened, and you will still need trucks and trucks and trucks of humanitarian aid. And yet again, who distributes that? Who can? UNRWA. So that's an impediment to whatever plan you have to move 1 million people out of Rafah.
Yeah, Deborah, I think that's been the key all along. The Israelis didn't learn the pottery barn rule that Colin Powell had in the Iraq War, when he said, if you break it, you own it. They break it, they don't want to own it. And that is what's remarkable. And so the distribution of food, of medicine, of shelter, of water, they don't want to be part of that at all, and have anything to do with it. And yet, the reality is, you can't let 1 million people, 2 million people starve, or don't have the kind of resources. And that's been the problem from day one. And I think it's one of the things that Biden pointed out when he was there in October 17. He said, don't make the mistakes we made. And yet they did it exactly. It's a sad state of affairs, as always, although there are these glimmers of hope, and maybe political leaders will make the right decisions, because certainly a ceasefire would help in the distribution of aid. That would certainly be the way to do it. Giles, let's switch over to the quite remarkable speech by every speech by Macron tends to be remarkable because he says things in ways that are partly about the news. But this was an analysis, an hour and 40 minutes at the Sorbonne on where Europe is going and where Europe is heading and where Europe is sitting. And a big interview with The Economist just this week as well, to sort of highlight things. And it painted a picture that wasn't that wasn't as optimistic as one would have hoped or expected from a French president.
Right. You get this. I mean, Tony Blair used to say, "I feel the hand of history on my shoulder" occasionally, and you get the sense that Macron likes to feel it the whole time. But he did last week choose a moment very self-consciously. It was a heavily trailed speech designed as a sequel to one that he made on France's place in the world and his vision of Europe's place in the world when he came to power in 2017. He gave this big speech at the Sorbonne. The line that I noted and I think sort of sums up his view of where Europe is best is the era of basing our production in China, that's Europe's production in China, of delegating our defense to the US, of getting our energy from Russia is over. The rules of the game have changed. And then, as you say, he just more recently gave a big interview to The Economist in which he spoke of a triple shock facing Europe. It's worth briefly enumerating them: a security shock, Russia, a China/technology shock, Europe being left behind, basically in the race to technology assisted wealth creation, and then a homemade democracy shock, in that most Western European, in fact European countries, face insurgent nationalisms, to one degree or other illiberal within their own countries, all of which, in Macron's view, threaten the European dream, European values, and of course, obviously, in Russia's case, the European space. And he memorably quoted, was it Marshall Bloch from 1940, on the speed with which things can unravel. And as you said, Europe can die. His solution, very briefly, is to sort the security problem and prepare for a future in which the US can no longer be relied upon. And economically, on the security front, that involves a great deal of organization to better coordinate the EU and NATO, the UK and the EU, to sort command and control, and then begin the mammoth Herculean task of beefing up European defense production, which of course now is an order of magnitude smaller than the US, on which we've depended for so long, and on Russia as well as Chinese capacity. An important meeting in all this is coming up in the UK in Blenheim Palace in July. It'll be a meeting of Macron's brainchild, the European political community, but the agenda will be very much security focused. We think, on the basis of yesterday's local elections in the UK, that the Prime Minister here will still be Rishi Sunak, and he may well hang on without calling an election precisely to host that meeting. Macron wants the European political community to be a forum for talking about the big European security challenges. And by the way, a lot of us Remainers stuck here in Britain hope that it might also be a Trojan horse for us back into or closer to the EU. And in all seriousness, everybody on both sides is saying that security, broadly defined, is the bridge back. But just 2 points to close. We are inching closer and to a time when European leaders are talking about material military assistance, including boots on the ground in Ukraine. But that will test European solidarity, especially in the central relationship between France and Germany. And Macron is correct, secondly, that because of its own preference for concentrating on regulation, the whole European space, the Eurozone, lags China and the US in AI, tech, quantum, everything that we think is going to generate wealth in the future. You mentioned just before we started the Euromaidan moment, if you like, huge demonstrations in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. I mean, what's happening there, very briefly, is the street is pro-European. The regime and the oligarch behind it, Bidzina Ivanishvili, are pro-Kremlin. This is what happens if Europe isn't strong in its own defense and in its allies' defense. There is an election coming up in Georgia in October. The danger is that the people are not heard, that it is, instead of being a free and fair election that produces a pro-European parliamentary majority, you have I'm trying to think of the right Ukrainian analogy, but you have a 2004 moment rather than the 2014 moment in Tbilisi.
Yeah, no, that's certainly a point to watch in Tbilisi. But Giles, I think you paint a great picture, and as usual, it seems to me, Deb, is that Macron is astute in his analysis of the situation, but doesn't quite have the answers to resolving the issues. They're pretty big, so it's not necessarily a surprise. I do wonder, though. You're in Berlin, as is Steve. One of the addressees of any French president when he's speaking about Europe is in fact not in Paris, but in Berlin. And I just wonder how the Germans were reacting both to the speech and everything else. I gather Scholz and Macron had a secret dinner that they then leaked, so it wasn't very secret last night in France, where Scholz is on vacation, which is in and of itself an interesting thing. But just how is this being played out in Berlin?
Well, I think Scholz had a mini meltdown about troops on the ground in Ukraine. That is completely out of the question for the Germans. But, I read that article in The Economist too, and they put in something that the Economist writer decided needed to be there, and not something Macron said. And it was this: nobody plays by the rules anymore. The old order is broken and nothing has replaced it, which I thought was the darkest thing in the story. And I also think that it is somewhat true. And that is what everybody is responding to, that there are no rules. We are in the age of impunity, and everybody's trying to figure out what to do about it, because there is no roadmap for where people go now.
Yeah, that's okay. So I thought that Macron was dark, but now you, but Deb, you made the point.
That's The Economist. That is The Economist's analysis.
No, but I think it's right. I mean, there is the order. This is a fight between disorder and order, between rules and not. And it does have a feeling that the rules that used to exist aren't being adhered to or even assumed at all. Steve, in your reporting, how was the Macron speech and sort of the analysis and the solutions seen not only in Berlin but in other places in Brussels?
It was seen partly as deeply political because of European elections, where his party is 10 points behind the National Front, as it used to be called, and that would be an earthquake. So this was part of what Macron was talking to be honest. It was partly the way the Germans interpreted his speech. It also was kind of odd because you could say Macron gave two speeches, because the Economist interview was less of an interview than a chance for him to expound. I mean, there wasn't a single challenge to anything he said in the transcript. Now, maybe there was in reality, but no one said, well, how are you going to do that? Or isn't France running out of money? Or why do you think Minsk was such a success? It was kind of an odd piece of work, though it did allow him to, again, talk about his favorite themes. I wish he'd done more. I've always felt he was right about Europe should do more in its own defense, and it shouldn't rely on America so much. And he's been saying that, and not enough has been done. If it started being done 2 years ago, I think we'd all be in a better place, including Ukraine. His come to Jesus moment on Ukraine, I think, is sincere, but it's also very late. I mean, his sort of sudden understanding that, oh my God, Russia is a real danger because it's messing with my election, he said. I think that's late. Because for a long time, his view was this will end and we're going to have a relationship with Russia because it's our neighbor. And that's kind of what the Germans think too. So I think he's also making a run at Central Europe, which is also aimed at Germany too, to find allies inside this bigger Europe that he's trying to show the Central Europeans who are very upset about Russia that he's with them anyway. So it's complicated. I mean, as usual, he's very intelligent. One has to admire him. I mean, he's very articulate, and at least this time he left Hegel out of it. He always drags Hegel in, but the problem with him always is the think tanker is fascinating, and the president is to me has a lot of shortcomings, and I think he's going to pay some of the price in the elections in May, I'm afraid, which will worry everybody. No, they're May, first round.
Oh, and for in the European elections?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Of course, it's French. Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're right. No. If I'm going to correct you, I had to be right.
Okay.
Apologies for that. Just Giles, it seems to me, Steve actually paints an interesting picture, a strategy in which Macron is trying to get the Central Europeans on his side. I was struck in the Economist interview and that you mentioned. He was also talking about getting the British more on his side. He talked about the Lancaster agreement and the defense arrangement between the only two nuclear powers. Is this an effort to surround Germany in order to make them clear that the only choice they have is to be with the growing trend of what he used to call strategic autonomy as a fundamental goal?
Well, he's tried this a couple of times. The first time, I think, was a month or two ago, when he tried to claim that France from the outset had been as staunch a military supporter of Ukraine as Germany had. And then everybody published the actual numbers. And the number of guns that France had sent, you could count practically on one hand. And so he's having a second go at that. But I suppose as long as the German Leopard tanks don't arrive in numbers, as long as Taurus missiles don't arrive at all, he can make that argument. I just wonder, actually, if there is a concept here of conventional as opposed to nuclear deterrence that he's trying to mobilize. The belated, as Steve pointed out, acknowledgement that the only way to face down a tough guy is to be tough. That the diplomatic approach that he tried at the beginning was doomed, and that if you can get the UK very willing to help for a variety of reasons, and the Baltics and Eastern Europe ditto for their own geographical reasons, into a new sort of ad hoc military formation, that might deter Putin and his army on the battlefield in some way, that the slow incremental assistance rendered hitherto and measured mainly in terms of sort of a few billion euros here and there has failed to do. I'm really thinking aloud, but it is a game of poker, I'm suggesting, that he's playing, and it's a form of deterrence without trying to get into nuclear deterrence.
Yeah, no, I think that's, yeah, go ahead, Deb. Yep.
Can I ask Steve a question? I'm really not here covering Berlin, but I read the papers, and I teach a class here, so I have some connection to people who watch. And the two things that I've noticed is Ukraine is no longer popular with Germans. They're kind of tired of it, and so that, in some ways, I think this is my question to you: does it limit his hand? And two, it's not clear how the very right-wing AfD will do in the elections in June. So I don't know, does Scholz also have his own domestic politics that he has to watch out for when Macron makes those statements? Does that explain why, when Macron talked about sending troops to Ukraine, he said, whoa, not us. We're not doing that.
Well, you're right. I mean, first of all, I can't see Germans putting boots on the ground against Russia anyway, but he is running against the AfD, bizarrely enough, in the context of Ukraine as the peace chancellor. I mean, he's an old SPD guy anyway, but that is his campaign. And to some degree, I believe on Ukraine, though he's unpopular, on Ukraine, he does kind of have his finger on German opinion. He's not leading German opinion, but Germans generally support Ukraine, but they don't want to get dragged into a war. And when he argues that the Taurus can hit Russia and that it can hit the Kerch Bridge and it would drag us into the war, which is why we can't do it, I think a lot of Germans say, yeah, well, that's actually right. I mean, they don't mind helping the Ukrainians. There are a lot of Ukrainian migrants here that, popular support is generally in favor of Ukraine, but they're very, very wary about being dragged into a war. And also the Germans, more than any, one has to hesitate, I think more than any other European population, are neuralgic about the nuclear issue. And so the risk of a Russian use of nuclear really sends shivers down German spines. But it is more complicated for the AfD because they're kind of pro-Russian, sort of, right? And this is an issue that hurts them. So they kind of concentrate on migration and crime, right? That's easier for them. But you're absolutely right. It's domestic politics in both places, it's just like, Macron's been trying to get Scholz to come to Paris with him and Ursula von der Leyen to see Xi Jinping. And Scholz apparently has said, no, I'm not going to do that. And I'm not surprised because he doesn't want to look like an underling, and he doesn't want to have the same arguments that Macron has. Their interests in China are actually rather different. So this is intriguing. And anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, the interests are different. For the French, it is making sure that the Chinese continue to buy luxury goods, and for the Germans, it's buying machinery and automobiles. It's a different it's a different piece. So I understand. Steve, let's a few minutes left here. I really want to talk about Burma. Your paper's done really remarkable reporting. Hannah Beach, the correspondent in the region, really has been doing yeoman's work to bring the issue to a wider public. But that said, not everyone has read her material, and it is an important story that is underreported, generally speaking. And a lot has been happening in the past few weeks. A lot has been happening in the last 3 years, but in the past few weeks. So, bring us, remind us what this is about and where we are.
I mean, it's you don't know really where to start. I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi's father, Aung San, who was the George Washington of Burma, died when she was 2. And she's been trying to carry this mantle of a somehow united Burma, which has always been a weird collection of many, many minorities, particularly on the periphery, that have, for 60, 70, 80 years been at war with central authority, off and on, the Karenni, all of these groups. But what you have now is, in a way, a renewed insurgency when Ne Win, who was the crazy military leader of Burma in the late 80s, and he was someone who believed, because of an astrologer, that all money should be divided by 9. So he demonetized the country and put out 45 and 90 chat notes because of this astrologer. And there was, in the late 80s, a democracy revolution that got great coverage, that I tried to cover, where you had students moving to the peripheries to fight with the Karen, to try to overthrow the central government. And finally, Aung San Suu Kyi got elected. And then there was this period of democratic rule, which has gone back and forth. And now, 3 years ago, you had yet another military coup by a group that calls itself the State Administrative Council. It used to call itself the SLORC, but it's still the same nasty Burmese military. And all of these armies around the center are trying to coalesce, and they have been winning territory. And what's been happening in the last couple of weeks is they've been winning more territory. And the Burmese military has put in a whole new conscription thing. It's been quite brutal. The military still holds the center of Burma, of Myanmar, and I don't know if it's really at risk. And even if it were at risk, if it fell, the history of all of these nationalities coming together in a coherent way is not long. So the worry I have, and Hannah did a beautiful job, as she does on everything, is that the country would simply fall apart. And that would make it, again, ripe as ever for rapacious Chinese, Thai businessmen, army, military people who've been struggling over the place ever since the British left. So it's an ugly moment. A lot of people are dying. There's a lot of disease. There's hunger. I mean, it's that and Sudan are the two stories we're not covering enough of that are pretty horrible, and all of them are much bigger and than the Israel-Gaza thing. I'm not saying they're better or worse, but they are serious, and a lot of people are dying, which leads many in the global South to say you only care about your own, frankly. So it is fascinating, and I'm glad you brought it up because it's real and it's important. And if Burma falls apart, that may not be a good thing either. But there's a lot to play for right now.
Giles, I think Steve, in 3 minutes, told us the post-war history of Burma, which is remarkable. Of course, it all started, as so many things do, with decolonization. And drawing lines on maps that made sense maybe somewhere, but not in the region that it actually applied. So the Brits have, of course, a long history in the region. How is the government paying any attention? What is how are people looking at this particular conflict?
The short answer to that question is no. Lord Cameron, David Cameron, the new Foreign Secretary, is a bit frenzied, a bit hyperactive at the moment and paying attention to everything he can in the time available because he's got a short time available to rehabilitate himself before the Conservatives are out of office. But broadly speaking, this government is concerned with its own survival and with the forthcoming general election. But on the broader question of colonial influence in Myanmar, question is, in the event that it breaks up, is China the next colonial power? Steve mentioned rapacious Chinese business types, but what about the Chinese state?
Well, they have a lot of interests there, that's for sure. And they've had military advisors back and forth. They've been supporting the military government, obviously, but as we know, the Chinese can be very flexible. So, as you know, you raise a very good question. I don't know the answer.
Well, I think part of the answer, and Deb, jump in here. Part of the answer be it's not clear that anybody can rule this place.
Well, what's interesting about juntas is they seem, that they that they make no mistakes until they collapse. That has been the surprise for me. I thought they never lose, and all of a sudden, that there is this swarm from the outside, and they're really doing well. So that's been the big surprise. It is not my area, so I see it, out to the side, but it's rather surprising.
It is surprising. We'll see how it ends up. But I'm glad we were able to have a discussion on this. We'll do Sudan as well because I think Steve's right. It is another area. There's some pretty horrific stuff happening in the Darfur region again. With the prospect of yet another major humanitarian disaster there as well happening, even as we are speaking. So we will get back to that. We just don't have time for everything every week. But the great news is that we did have time for having Giles Whittell of Tortoise Media, Deborah Amos of Princeton University, and Steve Erlanger of the New York Times here to talk about this week's major stories. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Thanks all for tuning in. Thank you three for enlightening all of us once again. And we'll be back next week. Have a great weekend.